How should you turn your feet in a side split? Should you turn your feet up or should you turn your feet in front of you? Let's talk about it.
The flexibility guy, Coach Elia.
Hey guys, I'm the flexibility guy, Coach Elia, and in this video I'll be explaining to you how to turn your feet during a side split position. But before I start, let me show you my book, Split Second, where you can find all the exercises and programs you can follow to achieve the splits. So if you want to get the splits, you can check out this book following the link in the description down below, alright? So, now, let's talk about the side split. Now, we gotta understand that there's not a best way to do the side split. You can do the side split with your feet pointing up and with your feet pointing in front of you. It's not the same, of course, but you can achieve the stretching position with both techniques. To understand the differences between the two side split techniques, you have to figure out two main concepts: hip abduction and hip external and internal rotation. Now, when you do a side split, you move your legs one away from the other, and this is called hip abduction, all right? And your hips, when they go into abduction, can be externally rotated or internally rotated. When you use the feet pointing up variation, you are externally rotating your hip in abduction, of course. Hip abduction, you always do hip abduction when you are in a side split. When you turn your feet up, you are using hip external rotation. When your feet are pointing in front of you, you are using hip internal rotation. When you move your leg into external rotation, your femur, which is the bone of your leg, has a better time sliding through the hip, and it can find a better range of motion. So that's why pointing up with your feet can be a great idea if you start or if you feel a kind of impingement in your hips. So some people, when they go into a side split, they feel like their hips are hurting, all right? And this may be due to the fact that when you go into a split, if you don't externally rotate and open your hips, your femur may enter in contact with your hip, all right? But if you externally rotate and you also anterior tilt, which means that you arch your lower back, you open your lower back, then your femur can slide through the hip and you can find the side split position. So, externally rotating is such a good idea, and turning your feet up helps you doing that. In terms of muscles activation, the external rotation activates and stretches two different groups of muscles: the adductors and the hamstrings. The adductors are always stretched in the side split because you move the legs one away from the other, and more in general, when you go into hip abduction with one leg or with both legs, you're gonna stretch the adductors. But the interesting part is that when you move your hip into external rotation, you'll be stretching also your hamstrings. And this is because by turning the leg in that way, your hamstrings will be in a stretched position, because external rotation and hip abduction, so the combination between hip abduction and hip external rotation, as we have seen for the feet pointing up variation, leads to a mild to soft hamstring stretch. It's not something really hard, because the main focus will always be on your adductors, but your hamstrings just enter in the stretch as well. Now let's talk about the second technique, the feet pointing forward technique. In this type of technique, your feet are pointing forward rather than up. Now you have to start with the idea that in a side split, as I've explained to you earlier, you have to externally rotate your femurs and to arch your back, to allow your femurs to slide through the hip and go into the side split position. So your femurs will be always a little externally rotated and your back arched. That's something that will happen for sure. But if you turn your feet in front of you, you'll go in a slightly more internally rotated position with your femurs and with your shin bones. So when you are in that kind of a position, you'll be stretching more your adductors and your hamstrings will come out of the stretch almost completely because there's not the same level of external rotation there was before, and this is sufficient to remove the hamstrings from the stretch and you'll be focusing more on the adductors. Also, this kind of activation shortens your pubofemoral ligaments, which are the ligaments you have in the front part of your hips, and when you internally rotate your femurs, those ligaments will be shortened a little bit, making the position a little easier to achieve. In conclusion, there's not a technique which is better than the other, they're just different. When you start working on your side split, you have to learn how to externally rotate your femurs because this is really important. And the feet pointing up variation may be the correct technique you want to use during the first steps you make into the side split journey. But as you move on, you may find the feet pointing forward variation slightly more comfortable to perform. It really depends on your joint structure also, and in particular regard to this topic right here, you may find the side split as a really painful position to perform. And you may feel pain inside the hip joint. So when you go into a split, you want to remember that if you feel the stretch on your adductors, on your hamstrings, this is good. But if you feel pain inside your hip, this is not good, all right? And this may be due to the fact that your femur is not externally rotating, is not sliding through the hip, and is touching the hip, all right? So in that particular case, turning your feet up may fix the problem. And that's why I suggest you use the feet pointing up variation to start. Get your side split with that variation, and then you can experiment with the feet pointing forward variation. That's my take, all right? Now, guys, if you have any questions, any doubts, any particular opinions about this topic right here, I'm really happy to answer to all your questions in the comments down below, because I know this is a complex topic and I really do want to have a chat with you if you have a different opinion from mine or if you have some questions or doubts. Also, don't forget to leave a thumb up if you enjoyed the explanations, and have a nice stretch. See you in the next video. Bye.